The council chamber was filled with arrogance that day. At the center of the vast hall, banners of countless conquered worlds hung like trophies, each a reminder of the Empire's supremacy. Around the polished table sat the lords and strategists of the Galactic Empire, their expressions carrying the same calm certainty that came from centuries of unchallenged dominion. They had reduced dozens of species to obedience, broken countless resistances, and turned once proud civilizations into obedient servants. To them, the talk of a small, distant world called Earth was barely worth a pause in their discussions. But one voice rose above their laughter. He was old, scarred, his scales dulled from age and battle. He had fought where few dared, survived where many had perished. His body bore marks of plasma fire, and one eye had long since been replaced with a crude mechanical implant. To the young officers he looked like a relic, a creature of stories told around firesides. But to him, every scar was proof of encounters no one else in that chamber could claim. He had seen humanity. "They are not what you believe," he said, his voice graveled yet steady. His words carried a weight, though the council shifted impatiently, already dismissing him in their minds. "You see primitives, bound to a single planet, fractured among themselves, unequipped to face a fleet such as ours. That is the mistake every conqueror has made before you. And it will be the mistake that breaks this empire." One of the admirals sneered. "You speak of them as though they were gods. They are flesh, as we are. They bleed. They fall." The veteran's lone eye burned with intensity. "Yes, they bleed. Yes, they fall. But they rise again. And again. And again. They fight beyond logic, beyond exhaustion. I have seen them adapt in the middle of battle, turn desperation into strategy, and transform loss into fuel for vengeance. When they are cornered, they do not surrender. They invent. They endure. They burn themselves if it means burning you with them." Laughter rippled across the chamber, a dozen voices echoing off the marble walls. The younger generals exchanged glances, entertained by what they saw as the ramblings of a broken soldier clinging to his ghosts. One leaned back in his chair and smirked. "Old myths. You give too much credit to a young, chaotic race. What can their crude machines do against the discipline of our legions? What can scattered nations do against the unity of our empire?" The veteran stepped closer to the table, his hands slamming against the polished surface with a force that silenced the room. His voice cut through the smugness like a blade. "I fought them when their fleets were nothing but steel and fire. I saw them claw victory from hopelessness. Do you know what it means to face an enemy that refuses to accept defeat as an option? To fight those who will sacrifice everything, not for empire, not for conquest, but simply because no one tells them when their fight is finished?" The room quieted for a heartbeat. Some eyes narrowed, others rolled in mockery, but a sliver of unease passed among them. It vanished quickly, drowned beneath the confidence of centuries of power. One counselor waved a dismissive hand. "Enough of your tales. The humans will fold as others have. The empire is eternal. Their resistance will be measured in days, not years." The veteran straightened, his expression carved from stone. "You think eternity belongs to you. You are wrong. Eternity belongs to those who refuse to bow, who would rather perish standing than live kneeling. That is humanity. You may crush their cities. You may kill their millions. But for every one who falls, another will rise with vengeance in their eyes. And when you believe them defeated, that is when your nightmare will begin." Murmurs spread through the chamber. Some scoffed, some ignored, but a few listened with uneasy silence. Yet pride was a fortress none of them could abandon. The empire had never been stopped. They would not allow the thought that a single, insignificant world could defy the weight of their history. The veteran's gaze swept across them one last time. He saw the certainty etched into their faces, the same certainty he had seen before, on the faces of those who had underestimated the humans and paid with fleets, with cities, with their very names wiped from memory. He knew his words would not change them. He knew they were deaf in their arrogance. As he turned and walked away, his voice echoed back across the grand hall, low and final, carrying the weight of prophecy. "You laugh now. You dismiss me now. But when the day comes when you face them, remember my words, you will beg for mercy from a species that has none to give. And then he was gone, leaving behind only silence, unease, and the laughter of those who thought themselves invincible. The Imperial Armada moved with the confidence of predators circling prey. Thousands of vessels stretched across the void, formations precise, movements drilled into perfection by centuries of doctrine. To the admiral standing at the heart of the fleet, this was not a campaign. It was a display. Their warships were monuments of power, each one capable of subjugating worlds on its own, and together they blotted out the stars. The Empire had never faced defeat, never endured humiliation. This would be no different. In the war councils, commanders traded predictions of how long it would take before Earth bent the knee. Some said weeks, others mere days. They compared humanity to other species that had once resisted, civilizations that had believed themselves unbreakable, until the Empire's engines of war ground them into dust. Their voices carried the same tone of detached calculation, as though they were discussing logistics, not lives. Reports of human defenses were circulated. Outdated warships, obsolete technology, fractured governments constantly at odds with one another, this was what the Empire saw. To them, humans were a fragmented nuisance, incapable of standing against the full weight of imperial discipline. Their analysis was filled with charts, comparisons, and probability graphs, all pointing to one conclusion: this war would not even qualify as a war. It would be an occupation. They dismissed the veteran's words as paranoia, the product of a soldier who had seen too much and believed too strongly in his scars. Some whispered that he had exaggerated encounters, twisting them into myths to justify his survival. Others joked that perhaps humanity had paid him to spread fear. None considered the possibility that his words were the only truths spoken in that hall. As the fleets neared their destination, the Empire's officers watched Earth with detached curiosity. They saw a blue planet wrapped in clouds, fragile compared to the steel fortresses drifting toward it. Its orbital stations were few, its patrol craft insignificant. The Empire's young officers laughed, remarking that even the sight of the fleet would be enough to shatter resistance. "They will kneel before our weapons fire even begins," one admiral declared, drawing nods of agreement. Among them, there was no doubt, no hesitation. Their empire had crushed species far older, far more advanced, and far more unified than these humans. Some remembered the fall of the Croth, who had boasted fleets twice as large as Earth's. Others spoke of the Ochre, who had centuries of unity, and still fell within months. By those measures, humanity was a trivial foe. The Empire's propaganda machines had already begun their work. Messages were broadcast ahead of the fleet, demanding surrender, promising leniency if humanity submitted peacefully. Entire planets had fallen under those words before, paralyzed by fear of annihilation. Surely this primitive world would respond no differently. The Empire's officials congratulated themselves on another swift conquest before it had even begun. The veteran watched all this unfold from the shadows of a lesser chamber. He had spoken his warning, and it had been ignored. Now he listened as the admirals placed bets on how quickly Earth would collapse, their arrogance louder than any engines. He recognized the same blindness he had seen countless times before. They mistook silence for weakness, confusion for incompetence. They forgot that sometimes the stillness before the strike was the most dangerous sign of all. Though he remained silent now, his mind returned to memories he wished he could forget. He remembered humans fighting until their bodies broke, remembered their ability to turn wreckage into weapons and defeat into resolve. He had seen them fight with nothing left, yet still managed to claw victory from the ruins. The Empire saw crude ships and divided nations. He saw a storm waiting to break. But the Empire never saw storms until they were already drowning. Their arrogance had carried them for too long, numbing them to the possibility of real resistance. And so, as their fleets descended toward Earth, as their leaders polished speeches about mercy and inevitable conquest, the veteran knew the truth. This was no prey they were hunting. It was something else entirely, something they would not understand until it was far too late. For now, though, the Empire laughed, confident as ever, blind to the fact that their greatest mistake was already in motion. The demands for surrender were sent with all the formality of empire. Long declarations, ornate seals, and promises of leniency if Earth submitted without struggle. The messages were broadcast across every channel, accompanied by images of imperial fleets lined in perfect formation. Entire civilizations had collapsed at the sight of such power, their leaders scrambling to preserve what little remained by bowing quickly. Yet from Earth came no response. Not silence born of panic or confusion, but deliberate, disciplined silence. Days turned into weeks, and the envoy's words echoed unanswered through the void. To the Empire, this was puzzling. Some officers grew impatient, insisting that humans were cowering, hiding, and too terrified to answer. Others mocked them, claiming Earth's leaders were debating which one of their fractured governments would carry the shame of surrender. Every explanation centered on weakness, for arrogance would not allow them to imagine anything else. But silence was not weakness. Beneath the surface of the planet, hidden far from the Empire's sensors, something stirred. Industrial zones that once produced civilian machines began running day and night, churning out weapons and supplies. Communications shifted to encrypted, localized systems, impossible to intercept. Energy signatures were masked, movements concealed, and what little the Empire's scouts could detect appeared ordinary, even mundane. It was camouflage, and it worked. Scouts reported human ships vanishing from standard patrol routes. Entire flotillas disappeared into asteroid belts or slipped into deep orbits where sensors failed to reach. When Imperial intelligence pieced together fragments of movement, the patterns made no sense. Instead of assembling a fleet in visible defense, humanity was dispersing, scattering its forces like smoke on the wind. To the Empire, this was confirmation of fear. To those who understood strategy, it was the mark of preparation. The veteran, watching from afar, recognized the signs immediately. Humans had always fought this way. They never showed their hand until the strike was ready. They preferred shadows to spectacle, patience to pride. Where other species displayed their power in desperate attempts to intimidate, humanity concealed theirs until the moment it was most devastating. It was a truth the Empire had never understood, and one they were about to pay for again. Inside Imperial councils, frustration mounted. They insult us with their silence, one commander snarled, demanding that the fleet fire a demonstration strike to shatter human morale. Others counseled patience, urging the humans be given more time to respond. They could not agree whether Earth's silence was cowardice or defiance. What they never considered was that silence was a weapon in itself. Every day that passed without an answer was another day of advantage for Earth. Their governments, divided as the Empire believed them to be, were united by the simplest truth: survival. Political differences dissolved in the shadow of annihilation. Resources were pooled, technology shared, and every hidden facility turned to the single purpose of preparing for war. The Empire thought it saw hesitation. What it truly saw was coordination, quiet, invisible, and dangerous. The silence gnawed at some of the younger officers. They had been raised on campaigns of swift victories, taught that enemies always bent quickly or died loudly. This enemy did neither. No surrenders were offered, no pleas for mercy were heard, but neither were there boasts or empty threats. The stillness was unnatural, unsettling, and more unnerving than open defiance. Yet those concerns were brushed aside by their superiors, who clung to the certainty of empire. The veteran alone understood what that silence meant. He remembered standing against humans who had seemed unprepared, only to discover their traps snapping shut with terrifying precision. He remembered underestimating their patience, only to find himself ambushed by plans set in motion long before the first shot was fired. He saw the pattern repeating, and he knew the storm was building behind the quiet. Still, no one listened. The Empire mistook the absence of noise for the absence of resistance. They convinced themselves that humanity's calmness was proof of inevitability. They never realized that silence can roar louder than any battle cry when it carries the weight of intent. And so the fleets drifted closer, banners raised, speeches rehearsed, waiting for the surrender that would never come. When the first order to advance was given, the Empire's fleets moved with perfect discipline. Columns of warships stretched like blades across the void, their weapons primed, their engines burning with power that had subdued countless worlds. They entered orbit expecting surrender, braced for submission. Instead, the silence deepened. No signals, no broadcasts, no flags of truce. The planet below seemed passive, almost resigned. To the admirals, it looked like fear at its peak. To the veteran, it was the calm before something catastrophic. The order to strike was inevitable. Orbital bombardment began with precision strikes, demonstrations meant to terrify rather than annihilate. Explosions lit the surface, and dust rose into the skies. Yet, in the command chambers of the Empire, confusion followed. The humans did not respond. No panic-stricken fleets launched to defend their world. No desperate transmissions begged for mercy. Nothing. The Empire believed victory had already been won, until the first ships began to vanish. It started small, an Imperial cruiser cut from formation by a sudden explosion. At first, they blamed malfunction or a stray shot. Then another vanished, consumed by fire without a detectable source. Reports poured in from across the orbit, systems shutting down, navigation scrambled, weapons rendered useless by intrusions no one could trace. The Empire prided itself on unbreakable networks, yet somehow those networks belonged to someone else now. Humanity was inside their systems. Suddenly, debris fields that had drifted harmlessly for decades came alive. Chunks of rock revealed hidden engines, cloaked mines ignited, and entire sectors of space became traps. Imperial ships collided, shields buckled, and fire consumed formations that moments earlier had been flawless. The Empire had expected resistance on the ground. Instead, they were bleeding in the skies, struck by an enemy they could not see. Then the human ships revealed themselves. They did not emerge massive, proud fleets. They came like ghosts, from asteroid shadows, from planetary poles, from orbits so deep the Empire's sensors had overlooked them. Civilian craft had been gutted and rebuilt into war machines. Mining vessels carried rail cannons capable of piercing through Imperial armor. Freighters became missile platforms. Every assumption of weakness was shattered in seconds. The humans did not fight for glory. They fought to kill. Ambush after ambush ripped through the armada. Imperial captains issued frantic orders, but their strategies unraveled as fast as they were spoken. Every move was anticipated, every adjustment countered. Humanity had studied the Empire with care, memorized their patterns, and now used that knowledge like a blade. What the Empire saw as discipline became predictability, and predictability was death. Panic rippled across the ranks. Reports came of ground bases lost before they were established, infiltration teams slaughtered before they touched soil, supply lines severed without warning. Imperial fleets attempted to regroup, but every rally point became a killing field. The humans were not matching the Empire's ship for ship, they were dismantling them piece by piece. For the first time in centuries, the Empire felt hunted. Their warships, designed to intimidate and dominate, were being shredded by smaller, leaner craft that struck with precision and vanished before retaliation could land. Entire squadrons disappeared into silence, their last transmissions nothing but screams and static. The Admiral's confidence dissolved into chaos as they realized they had walked into a war humanity had prepared long before the first ultimatum was sent. The veteran, watching reports flood in, felt no satisfaction, only inevitability. This was what he had warned them of. Humanity's silence had not been fear but preparation. Their scattered governments had become a unified fist, their outdated machines transformed into weapons of terror. The Empire had expected submission. What they had received was retribution. By the time the Empire understood the scale of the disaster, it was too late. Their formations were broken, their command chains shattered, and their soldiers gripped by something they had never felt before, fear of prey that fought like predators. The Empire had marched into battle with certainty, but certainty had turned to ruin. Weeks into the campaign, their fleets were unrecognizable. Formations that once shone like blades in the dark were now scattered wreckage drifting through orbit, their banners torn, their signals silenced. Human strikes had not been grand, nor overwhelming. They had been surgical, relentless, and utterly merciless. Where an imperial ship stood, eventually only debris remained. Where soldiers landed, none returned. The Empire had measured humanity by numbers, and in doing so had missed what truly made them dangerous. Survivors whispered of ambushes that came from nowhere, of human weapons striking before warnings could even be raised. Entire divisions reported fighting enemies who did not retreat, who bled and burned yet refused to yield ground. For every human who fell, two more seemed to take their place, armed with weapons built from scavenged wreckage or traps laid in silence. They did not fight for conquest, nor for expansion, but for survival, and survival turned them into something terrifying. Commanders who had once mocked the veteran now sat in silence, their reports filled with defeat after defeat. They had expected victory measured in days. Instead, their losses piled into the thousands. Supply chains disintegrated, communication collapsed, and the Empire's proud war machine was consumed from within by fear. They had underestimated an enemy who did not fight by their rules. They had expected submission. Humanity had answered with total war. The council that had laughed at warnings now trembled as the scale of disaster reached them. Attempts to reinforce the fleet were intercepted. Every convoy became a target. Every stronghold turned into a graveyard. What terrified them most was not the weapons humanity unleashed, but the mind behind them. Strategies emerged that should have taken years to perfect, yet were executed flawlessly in weeks. Humanity learned faster than any foe the Empire had ever faced, adapting with each encounter, growing deadlier with every loss they suffered. The veteran was summoned again, but this time there was no laughter when he entered. The arrogance that had filled the chamber was gone, replaced by silence heavy with dread. He looked at their faces, once dismissive, now pale, and spoke words they could no longer deny. "I told you they would not yield. I told you they would turn every strike into fuel for their fire. You believed yourselves eternal. Now you see eternity belongs to those who cannot be broken." The Empire sued for peace, cloaking their desperation with words of diplomacy. Yet even as they offered treaties, they feared the answer. Humanity had shown them that mercy was not a given. The humans did not gloat, nor boast of victory. They simply held their ground, unflinching, reminding the Empire with their silence that this war had not been their choice, but their response. Stories spread quickly through the galaxy. Soldiers who returned broken spoke of battles where humans fought with weapons fashioned from wreckage, of ambushes in the dark that left entire fleets gutted. Whispers grew into legends, and legends into fear. The Empire, once unshakable, now lived with a scar. For the first time in living memory, their enemies believed the Empire could be defeated. For the first time, the Empire itself believed it too. The veteran left the council for the final time. No one stopped him, no one mocked him, for his warning had become reality. His last words were quiet, but they echoed across the chamber and would never be forgotten. "You will remember them not as prey, but as the hunters who taught you fear." Their silence was not weakness. It was the promise of what was coming. Generations later, children of conquered worlds would still whisper the name of the species that stood when all logic said they should fall. They spoke of humans, the ones who turned despair into weapons, who taught the greatest empire the meaning of terror. The Empire itself would never again march toward Earth with arrogance, for they knew that behind that silence lay a fire no fleet could extinguish.